Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. Today we are continuing our reading of Hannah Arendt's book on revolution. We are nearing the end. We're in chapter 5 of 6, and as we discussed last time, chapter 5 is part of two chapters, chapters 4 and 5, that are both called by the title Foundation. Chapter 4 is Foundation 1, and chapter 5 is Foundation 2. And chapter 5 carries the subtitle Novus Ordo Saeclorum. This is a Latin phrase that is taken and yet changed from the fourth eclogue of Virgil, lines 5 to 8. And the line of Virgil is Magnus ab integro saeculorum nascitur ordo, or the great cycle of the ages is born again, born afresh with a new order. The Novus Ordo Saeclorum, which is the phrase that's on our dollar bills, what that means is a new order of the ages. And it was to reflect the newness of America. But Arendt is here with this subtitle, Novus Ordo Saeclorum, is trying to do something else, is trying to show us and argue for us that America was not just a new thing, a new political entity, a new city on the hill, that it was in important ways a rebirth. And the tie-in to Virgil is deeply important in this regard. The last part of this chapter, the last 5 or 6 pages, is very much about Virgil's play, the Aeneid, poem, the Aeneid, which is a tale of, or tells the tale of, the birth of Rome through Aeneas, but in such a way that it is not just a birth that's new, but is a rebirth of Troy, and thus carries a continuity and is a way of a combination of Troy and the people who were living in the area of Rome at this time. And so the idea of the great cycle or integration, Magnus ab integro, the integration of a new age, a new order, into an already existing cycle of ages, is what Arendt sees as the topic of Virgil's poem. And what she's here arguing about the United States is that the way the United States established itself was not to simply imagine it as something new, but as the rebirth of an ancient order. In this regard, not as the rebirth of Troy, but as the rebirth of the Roman Republic. And in doing that, it borrowed some of the authority of the Roman Republic for the new American Republic. But more importantly, it explicitly, in Arendt's view, borrowed the idea and the way in which the old Roman Republic imagined its authority, and thus was an attempt to create authority in an age in which authority is largely absent. If you read her wonderful essay, What is Authority, in Between Past and Future, which begins with the line, we should actually say not what is authority, but what was authority, because authority has been lost, you'll get a sense of the way these two essays, this chapter 5, and the essay What is Authority, need to be read in conjunction with one another, because the argument here is that even though authority has been lost in the modern age, um, the United States was the one successful founding, not only of a republic and not only of power, as we talked about in chapter 4, but of authority. And so it's important to remember that at the end of chapter 4, Arendt makes this distinction between power and authority. And she says that um, America was the rebirth of the Roman idea of the power in the people, the potestas in populo, um, and that this was natural in many ways to America because of the townships and this spirit of self-government, this which she, following Tocqueville, calls the spirit of freedom, which came out of the townships and out of the local governments. That is, she found, so deep and abiding and powerful in the United States. But what she says is that it wasn't just the rebirth of power and Roman ideas of power, it was also the rebirth of the Roman idea of authority. And whereas power was in the people, authority was in the Senate. And so you have this famous phrase, Senatus Populusque Romanus, SPQR, um, which means that the Roman Senate and the people combine together to form the Roman Republic. And it's in the Senate, she argues, that we have authority, and in the people that we have power. And so for Arendt, the chief problem of the American Revolution, and this is a quote from page 171, the chief problem of the American Revolution turned out to be the establishment and foundation not of power, but of authority. And so this is what chapter 5 is. In a sense, power was easy because in America, power was almost natural in its in the forms that the townships took. But authority, how do you create authority? And that requires us to ask, what is authority to a certain extent? And for her, authority is when one obeys or follows something, not because of reason or power or violence, but simply because it's right, or it seems to have that kind of magisterial, reverential authority that one follows. And outside of religion and customs, uh, how do you create authority in an age of the Enlightenment where people have their own, ask always why, what is at stake, why should I follow this, why should I obey the law, why should I grant these people the authority to govern me? The text in English is broken into two parts. Interestingly enough, in the German edition, which Arendt herself translated and oversaw, this chapter is divided into three sections. The third section is just an extra section. The text is the same, but it starts on page 196 in your text, and at a line break, so I'll point it out when we get there. Part one is largely background and historical. She says that the problem is to find a form of government which puts the law above men. How do we, and why do we need to do that? Well, because if we are constantly, through our power, making laws, the laws can always be changed. They can always be serving human interests, and there'll be no stability in the world. How do we create a constitutional authority that gives rise not only to power, but also to a series of laws that will be in some sense lasting, and that we make them today, and tomorrow people say, we should obey those laws, not, well, those were made by our ancestors, let's make new ones. We need to be able to change them, but we also need to have some sense that we're in a continuous cycle. And what she says is what the revolutions taught us, the French Revolution and the American Revolution together, is that there's always a need for an absolute. You need a kind of God to give you these laws. Otherwise, the laws seem like arbitrary exercises of power by people from the past or people from another country. And why should we obey them? And in France, they found this absolute in the people. And this was, as we talked about in the last session, dangerous insofar as that the people was unitary and sovereign and thus tyrannical. And what she's trying to argue here is that in America, there was a different discovery of the absolute. And she goes through a series of historical contrasts, so that Robespierre says you need an immortal legislature, someone who stands outside and above to make the laws, so that the laws are not just the laws of another people, but of an immortal divine sanction. John Adams said we need a supreme being or a great legislature of the universe. And Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence says that they are the laws of nature and of nature's God. Arendt thinks that it was an error to think that throughout history authority was always and only given by a divine sanction. And so on page 178, she says that it was John Adams' error to think that the ancients, the Greeks and the Romans, had derived the authority of law from divine authority. And she says on page 178, for the point of the matter is that Adams was in error, and that neither the Greek nomos nor the Roman lex was of divine origin. The Greek lawgiver, she says, was pre-political and outside the polis, but it wasn't above the polis. It was a stranger who came in and gave laws, but it wasn't a divine entity. And the Roman law was a bond, a lex, a joint. Something which use means a joint or a connection. It was a system of alliances rather than a system of sovereignty. And this fits for Montesquieu as well, for whom, and we've talked about this, law was a rapport, bridges and connections that held things together. And so she says there's a long tradition of law that is not seen as imposed from above, but as a kind of series of connections and bonds and things that hold us together. And that the idea of law that comes from above is, she thinks, a Judeo-Christian law, a divine law, but is not the only one we could imagine. Okay, that's part one of this chapter. In part two, which is really the extraordinary argumentative center of this chapter, she makes a number of points. She says that America has escaped the absolute authority of the nation state, and it has done so, as she talked about in chapter 4, with this multiplication of powers through federalism. But you still need authority, because even with all these multiple powers, how are we ever going to have any kind of stability in the country? And so we need a foundation, we need an absolute, and yet it has to be an absolute that's not divine, because we're an Enlightenment country. And so she wants to look for that absolute in an act of founding, and that's the question of this chapter. And it's the really and the argument of the chapter is that the Americans really are the only successful modern attempt of revolutionary founding, where the act of founding in some way leads to a veneration of the founding, and this venerable act authorizes a new authority, and gives the political union a patina of perpetuity and justice. In a sense, it immortalizes the union as deserving of being revered and celebrated. And that's That's an extraordinary act to happen. And she says that the Americans were successful in this, part by accident and part by uh, good study and thought. And the study part was that they studied Rome, and that they were inspired by Rome. Um, and the luck part, the good fortune part, is that somehow they hit on this idea of a written constitution that would be the seat of authority, and it worked. Um, why it worked, she's not sure, uh, and I don't think there's an answer for it. But she says a number of things on pages 190 to 193. So take a look on 190. She writes, many historians, especially in the 20th century, have found it rather disconcerting that the Constitution, which in the words of John Quincy Adams, quote, had been extorted from the grinding necessity of a reluctant nation, end quote, should have become overnight the object of, quote, an undiscriminating and almost blind worship, as Woodrow Wilson once put it. So it's a fact, she says, however it happened, that the Constitution became an object of undiscriminating and blind worship. On 190 to 91, she says, quote, the simple fact that the revolution here succeeded where all others were to fail, namely in founding a new body politic stable enough to survive the onslaught of centuries to come, one is tempted to think was decided the very moment when the Constitution began to be worshipped, even though it had barely begun to operate. And this is really the key move in the chapter, is to say this Constitution became worshipped. And as an object of worship, it was a absolute, but not a divine absolute, one that had a collective buy-in to it. How did that happen? Right? And again, partly good fortune, but also partly some thought. And the first step of that is that the institutional locus of the Constitution's authority was the Supreme Court. And so she writes on 192, institutionally, it is lack of power combined with permanence of office, which signals that the true seat of authority in the American Republic is the Supreme Court. And this authority is exerted in a kind of continuous constitution making. For the Supreme Court is indeed, in Woodrow Wilson's phrase, a kind of constitutional assembly in continuous session. And so this is very much central. Constitutional assembly in continuous session. There is an institutional space, the Supreme Court, which is not just about interpreting the Constitution, but it's a powerless body. It has certainly no violence that it can exert, but it has no power to change anything except the fact that it can sit and argue and make decisions. And it's this powerless body that, in certain ways, is the seat of authority. And we need to understand why that is. And we do so, or she does so, through the analogy of the Supreme Court to the Roman Senate. So she writes on pages 192 to 193, while the American institutional differentiation between power and authority bears distinctly Roman traits, its own concept of authority is clearly entirely different. In Rome, the function of authority was political, and it consisted in giving advice, while in this American Republic, the function of authority is legal, and it consists in interpretation. So just so we understand what we're saying here is, in Rome, power was in the people, but authority was in the Senate. And what the Senate could do was advise, consent, and at times veto rules made by the people. But it was not in itself a powerful body. It was more an advisory body. Similarly, in America, the seat of authority is not in what the American Senate, which is also a powerful body along with the House of Representatives and part of the Congress. But power is moved from the legislature to the judiciary. And so she continues, the Supreme Court derives its own authority from the Constitution as a written document, while the Roman Senate, the patres or fathers of the Roman Republic, held their authority because they represented, or rather reincarnated, the ancestors whose only claim to authority in the body politic was precisely that they had founded it, that they were the founding fathers. Through the Roman senators, the founders of the city of Rome were present. Let me read that again. Just make sure you are catching this. Through the Roman senators, the founders of the city of Rome were present. And with them, the spirit of foundation was present. The beginning, the principium and principle of those res gestae, which from then on form the history of the people of Rome. There's an incredible, and I mean that in many ways, incredible argument going on here that I think has been not fully understood by most people who do talk about this book. The argument is that in Rome, the authority that the senators held was that they were the nobility and that they traced their ancestry back all the way to the founders of Rome. And that they, in a sense, as she said, represented, or rather reincarnated, the ancestors whose only claim to authority was that they had founded the body politic. This, speaking of reincarnation, is an extraordinary thing to see in a book of political thinking by Hannah Arendt. But what she's arguing is that the theory of representation, the idea of representation that the Romans employed was not simply one of voting or lot, which are two of the main ways and that we think of representation happening, but through the nobility and through descent, imagining that the people who are now the heirs of the founders are actually reincarnations of them and in some way speak for them, combining both the original founding moment, the principle of foundation of the founding fathers, with the modern need to govern today. And it's this bringing together of these two different sides, the need for permanence and the need for change, the need for a founding moment and the need for augmentation. That is the great challenge of authority, and that the Romans solved through this idea of reincarnation. And I think what Arendt is saying, I'm fairly confident, is that the American Supreme Court, in its being a constitutional assembly in constant meeting with their big robes and fancy things, is not simply a bunch of 9 justices to interpret the Constitution, but is like a reincarnation of the founding moment. And when then they speak and they interpret the Constitution, they're again merging the founding moment with the present moment. That there's a kind of the principle of beginning is brought forward into the present, and the present is returned back, always inspired by that principle of beginning. And so what she then goes on to gloss this to say is that on 193 she writes, for auctoritas, authority, whose etymological root is augere, to augment and increase, depended upon the vitality of the spirit of foundation, by virtue of which it was possible to augment, to increase, and enlarge the foundations as they had been laid down by the ancestors. Authority, augere, to augment and increase, means that the vital principle of the beginning has to be there, and it can be enlarged and increased. But you have to always have the ancestors present. And that the Constitution, when it became worshipped, became, in a sense, the ancestors. And the Supreme Court is this weird body of representative reincarnated ancestors who augment and increase that moment, but are always inspired by that moment. She writes on 193 again, the very coincidence of authority, tradition, and religion, all three simultaneously springing from the act of foundation, was the backbone of Roman history from beginning to end. The coincidence of authority, augere, augmentation, but back, and tradition, which is the carrying over, traditio, and religion, the bonding, relegare, the rebonding to the beginning. All of these are part of the act of foundation. That when you found something, you create authority, tradition, and religion. And thus she continues on 193, by virtue of auctoritatis, permanence and change were tied together. In this augmenting, we have change and permanence, and we tie them together, and that's the magic. And she writes on 193 to 94, because authority meant augmentation of foundations, Cato could say that the Constitutio Rei Republicae was the work of no single man and of no single time. By virtue of auctoritas, permanence and change were tied together, whereby, for better and worse, throughout Roman history, change could only mean increase and enlargement of the old. And that's the secret sauce of authority. That change was never change. It was not a new order of the ages, right, despite what's on our currency, but it was an integration of the ages with a new order. And that's the change she really wants to make. On 194, I'm just going to end with one or two last observations. She writes, the last point, namely that foundation, augmentation, and conservation, take these seriously, foundation, authority, augmentation, and conservation all go together, are intimately related, might well have been the most important single notion which the men of the Revolution adopted, not by conscious reflection, but by virtue of being nourished by the classics and having gone to school in Roman antiquity. The very concept of Roman authority suggests that the act of foundation inevitably develops its own stability and permanence and authority. In this context is nothing more or less than a kind of necessary augmentation by virtue of which all innovations and changes remain tied back to the foundation, which at the same time they augment and increase. Thus, amendments to the Constitution augment and increase the original foundations of the American Republic. Needless to say, the very authority of the American Constitution resides in its inherent capacity to be amended and augmented. This is, I think, clearly her argument that the American Constitution follows the Roman model of authority, and that the act of foundation created a constitution, a written constitution, which was to be constantly augmented by amendment and interpretation in a way that the spirit of the foundation would stay alive and the changes would be tied back through this magical reincarnation, such that the changes were still seen as acts of the founding fathers. And so she can say, in addition, that as long as the American Constitution continues to be worshipped, she thinks that it is highly likely that authority in America will, in some sense, remain, whereas throughout most of the world, authority has been diminished. So that's the argument about the foundation to the source of American authority in a Novus Ordo Saeclorum. Actually, in a Magnus ab integro Saeculorum nascitur ordo. I leave you with that. I look forward to discussing the text with you. Thank you very much, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.